The GLO is the flagship publication for the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. And it was first released or published in September 2017. Essentially, the GLO focused on three key issues. One, to look at the challenges that are being faced globally. It looked at the transformative policies and practices that affected countries, notably in Africa, are applying to try and deal with these challenges or showcase pathways that are cost effective and that can be scaled up to deal with water and land management. They've just released the second version of the GLO. The GLO report also has a range of thematic reports. So the UNCCD Secretariat have been producing regional reports focusing on specific regions. So there's been some in Latin America, there's been some in Southeast Asia, a number in Africa, West and East Africa, and on this occasion they focused on Southern Africa. And they released that as well at the COP15 in Abidjan. There was a call by the UNCCD Secretariat for experts to put in proposals and submissions to lead the development of the Southern African thematic report, GLO thematic report. I put in a submission and I was interviewed as part of the UNCCD panel. They were really interested to find out about my experience in working in the region, in Southern Africa and with the SADC states, and also to find out what other projects I worked on. So with the Southern African Power Pool, with the various governments on state of environment reporting and a range of other things. And they were very intrigued by that. And also wanted to know more about my understanding of some of the sort of issues, land management issues in the region. Based on that, I was appointed to lead a team. I then drew in a number of SRK experts to work with me in preparing this Southern African GLO report. The reporting process took several months. We worked very, very closely with the UNCCD Secretariat, as well as their partner, which is the SADC Secretariat. And in that process, we reviewed a plethora of documentation, policies, strategies, plans that have been produced by the SADC Secretariat. We looked at seminal documents around state of environment reporting and land management, and also looked for a whole range of case studies. We then actually also looked at, worked at preparing the document. It had to be a science-based document, easy to access by policymakers, a lot of infographics, a lot of case studies to showcase what countries are doing at a national level and a sub-regional level around the region. And so we then prepared that document, and it was also informed by some workshops with key stakeholders around the region, and ultimately it was adopted by the SADC Secretariat and released. The Southern African GLO report is a fairly compact science-based report, lots of infographics, trying to get a sense of what the current status is of land, water and other resources in the region, based on the data that we reviewed and looked at. So it sets out the picture as it exists now and what the data sort of highlights. It then goes on to look at some of the sort of key cross-cutting and other issues that are and challenges that are being faced in managing land resources in the region. So cross-cutting issues such as climate change, which has significant issues and affects many of these systems. Issues around urbanization, which are quite dramatic. Southern Africa, like the rest of Africa, is experiencing significant urbanization, people moving from rural areas into urban areas, and how does that play out in land management and land degradation? It looks at issues around gender and human rights. So it highlights some of those sort of key challenges. There's always a fundamental tension between the needs of maintaining some of the ecosystem goods and services that support water systems, land systems, etc. And then the demands from society for water, for land, for energy, and how these actually intersect. And those linkages are very, very interesting. So we also then look at something called the land, water, energy nexus to say that there is an interplay between those three. So you can't understand or get a very good picture of land degradation without understanding those systems and how they interplay. And then we feature a range of case studies. And for us, that was very, very important because there are some really good experiences that we can showcase in different parts of the Southern African region. So we showcased a range of different types of case studies in water management, land management, energy aspects. We even included focused on natural resources management like mining and what role they're playing in this regard. And then finally, the report uses as a background the strategy that's been developed by the Southern African Development Community Secretariat, or SADC, to look at the Great Green Wall Initiative as a big regional initiative, and to look at pathways that can be used to implement not just the strategy but achieve sustainable land management and land degradation neutrality. And that's going to involve policies, and involve setting up mechanisms for funding. It's going to involve multiple stakeholders, international, regional and national, and very, very importantly, it's going to have to involve communities, because I think the top-down approach is, I think there's a fairly good body of evidence that suggests that that's not the only approach. You have to marry that with a bottom-up approach where you actually partner with communities, because that's really when it becomes effective on the ground level. So there are 16 member states of SADC. These states are signatories to a range of conventions, including the UNCCD. On the basis of that, they need to actually report on certain targets. And these targets really focus on how are they managing issues around degradation and land management. They focus on water management, it focuses on how they're managing their biological diversity, and also dealing with climate change, mitigating climate change effects, or even adapting to them. So we find in the documentation we reviewed and those reports that the countries have submitted to the various bodies, secretariats, including the UNCCD, we notice that some are faring better than others. Some are reporting on a whole range of targets and are fairly, it's fairly clear to see how they're doing. And it's not to say that all states are faring well. We find that this is a challenging issue. It's got many different aspects that they need to address. They need funding, they need capacity to manage land resources. They need to deal with policy alignment, not just within their country, but across the region. You know, desertification, like climate change, doesn't stop at a political boundary. It moves across. And as we can see in the data and in much of where desertification is being experienced, it affects many, many countries in Southern Africa. So you really need a regional approach and strategy to addressing it. So you need the countries themselves to have various strategies to try and deal with and to implement policies that deal with land management. And drought management and how they deal with hazards and hazard management. And effectively, you need to make sure that these countries also work together, not just with their other member states and their neighbours, but also with funders, funding agencies, and bodies such as the UNCCD Secretariat, who are showcasing good practices around land management, sustainable land management, that come not just from Africa, but also come from other regions like Latin America and Southeast Asia. So what's working and what's not working, and taking the best and applying it to the context of Southern Africa.